Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm late. Can you hear me? I was having some technical troubles this morning, and I will admit. Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. Big thanks to Rachel and Shelley for moderating, especially because I was late today. Um, I also kind of have no idea what I'm doing. So thank you all for joining me. I'm going to try to put my presentation on the screen while I talk. Um, Not sure how to do that. I promise I was practicing this technology before I logged in. Um, there we go. Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate that. Okay, so welcome to the AuthorTube Writing Conference for 2024. I'm Laura Hum. I'm a dialogue doctor, coach, and developmental editor, and I'm here to talk to you today about the 5 mistakes that you make when you're editing and how to fix them. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but when I share, I'm not necessarily going to be able to see you. So I'm going to rely on Rachel and Shelley, who are fantastic moderators, and they're going to take care of the chat. And then when I stop sharing the screen, I'll come back and we can talk a little bit more. So here we go. Okay, so a little bit about me. I have been a training designer for about 20 years, and that has been really exciting for me because the training we develop takes the place of role plays in training. So I have been side by side with the foremost experts on conversation for 20 plus years. That's given me a lot of insight on how people talk to each other, especially when things are really emotional. And about 10 years ago, one of my friends and the dialogue doctor, Jeff Elkins, decided he was going to write a fiction book and asked me to be a beta reader. And I didn't really know what a beta reader was, but I read a lot of books and I read his book. And I had a lot of thoughts for him on how the characters talk to each other. I think because I had so much training in my day job on how people talk to each other. So after I read his book, I gave him some suggestions on what I thought could be helpful in making his story more engaging as a reader. And I was very surprised when he not only took my notes, but he asked me to edit his future books. And I was very humbled and excited to be able to share my thoughts and ideas because I don't know about you all, but as I read, even I remember being like 12 and 13 and reading Stephen King books, thinking, why didn't he do this? Or why didn't he make this character do that? And now, obviously, Stephen King has made quite the career for himself and did not need my 12-year-old suggestions. But ever since then, I've kind of been thinking about how can authors tell their story in different ways to connect to their readers. So when Jeff started the Dialogue Doctor about 4 years ago, he asked me to come on the journey with him. And ever since then, I've been a developmental editor and a writing coach. And the reason that I wanted to come to you and talk to you today is because editing is really hard. First of all, it's time consuming. You already know what your story is. So finding the places in your story where you're not connecting with the reader can be really hard. There's also this thing in writing. Doesn't matter what you're writing, you can't see your own mistakes. If it's a text message, if it's a proposal for work, if it's a short story, if it's a novel, sometimes we just can't see what's missing because we wrote it and we know what it's supposed to say. So sometimes we don't actually get what's on the page and how it's connecting. Another reason that writing is hard is writing is an act of love. It takes our time away from our family and our friends and the other things that we do. we pour our hearts and our souls into our stories, our characters really come to life. So making changes once we've put all that hard work and all that love into a story can feel overwhelming. It can feel hard because we have this emotional connection to the story. The last thing that I've found about editing that is so hard is that sometimes we just don't know what we're looking for. Lots of times when I'm working with a client, they'll give me a story and they'll say, Laura, I've worked on this, I've edited it 3 or 4 times, and I just don't know. Every time I edit it, it's just not getting any better. So I wanted to start today with some just general tips on how to make editing a little bit easier. And then we can go into the 5 mistakes that we tend to make when we're editing. So the first tip is take time between writing and editing. Again, you know your story, you know what the page is supposed to say. So maybe you don't actually get a chance to separate yourself from what you've written and what you've thought as an author to what your readers are going to experience. The more time you take between writing and editing, the easier it is for you to take off your writing hat and put on your reading hat. The next tip is pretend you know nothing. And when I say pretend you know nothing, I mean nothing. Forget everything you know about your story, even if this is the last chapter in your book. Forget every chapter that's come before, because it could be that a reader has put your book down and needs to come back to it at a later time and might have forgotten all the details, even if they were on just the page before. Forget everything that you know about writing. Forget everything you know about good plot, good character design, character development. You can even, I'm giving you full permission, forget everything I said today about editing when you read, because your readers don't know any of that. They're just there for the emotional experience. So just come into reading your story as if you were a brand new reader experiencing your story for the first time. I guarantee you're going to see something different than if you're coming at it through your author lens. The next tip, read your story out loud. There's something different in the brain. There are people way smarter than me who have figured this out, but your brain thinks differently when you hear something versus when you read something. When you're writing, you're seeing it as a reading in your brain. When you're listening, you're hearing it differently. Your brain is processing it differently. Plus, you're experiencing it more like your reader when it's being read aloud. If you have a tool, we're going to talk about this a lot. If you have a tool that will allow you to use a read aloud mode, absolutely use that. It's going to help you so much with your diagnostics. The next editing tip is find a reader you trust whose feedback you're going to take. Not everybody's lucky enough to have an editor who they can talk about their story with, bounce ideas off of, but almost everyone has somebody who can read their story and tell them what they think. If your reader tells you something about your story, listen to them. They may not be able to tell you how to fix it, but they can tell you what's wrong, and you can think about how to fix it. And the last editing tip is be bold. Sometimes the small little changes that we make aren't really enough to fix the things that we need to fix to make our story really memorable and really easy for our readers to understand and enjoy. So the 5 mistakes people make when they're editing. The first one, kind of coming right off of that be bold, is minimal change. The next is low emotional impact. Then we have unbalanced dialogue, muddy voices, and reader burden. So let's spend a few minutes talking about each one of these, how we can find them, and how we can fix them. So the first one is minimal change. Often when we're editing, we focus on what we as the author don't like and what we want to change. But we're not always thinking about what changes are going to impact the reader's emotional experience. Most of the time, readers show up to your story because they want to go on an emotional journey with the characters on the page. That means they want to feel what they're feeling when they're excited and adventurous. The reader feels excited and adventurous. When the characters on the page are feeling down and sad, you want your reader to feel down and sad. So if we're focusing on what we don't like and what we don't like, what we like and what we don't like, not what we don't like twice, then we're not really focusing on what's happening with the reader. So what we can do is we can ask ourselves a series of questions that are going to help us connect better with the reader's experience and know how to make changes better. The first question we're going to ask is, how does the reader feel? The next one we're going to ask is, where is the reader connecting? Sometimes we want the reader to connect with the characters. Sometimes we want them to connect with the story, but we always want them connecting with something. It's that connection that gets them to turn the page. Once we know that they're connecting, we want to ask ourselves, how does the reader know the characters? Think about how in real life you get to know somebody. You get to know them when they talk to you. So our readers get to know our characters through dialogue. So we're going to want to make sure that we have enough dialogue on the page that our reader has a chance to get to know our characters. And then the last thing that we want to ask ourselves is, what's hard to understand? Once we know what's hard to understand, we can make the reader's emotional experience a little bit easier for them because we can add those details. Now, you might have noticed that there are 4 questions here, and there are 5 things that are hard about editing and 5 mistakes we make about editing. Making meaningful change in our story most of the time is going to mean focusing on one of the other 4 mistakes. So if you're not sure how to make a meaningful change, look at all of the different types of errors that you can make and focus in on one of those to make a change. As you're focusing on all changes in editing, I have a very simple 3-part plan for making plans before you start editing. And I say I have it. Every editor is probably going to tell you the same thing. First, you're going to read. Again, going back to the general tips, if you can put space between when you wrote and when you read it out loud. Again, if you have technology that'll read it to you, I'm always going to recommend that. You're going to hear something different than if you're reading it. Highlight. I love color. So when I'm editing, especially when I'm editing with a new client, I'm going to color code the pages just to make things easier to see and to spot. Depending on the kind of edit I'm doing, determines what I use those highlights for and those colors for. And we'll talk about using color as we talk about the next 4 mistakes that we want to fix in our editing. And the last thing that we want to do is we want to make notes. The reason we want to make notes as we're reading and highlighting is sometimes when we get really excited about making a change, we make a change very early on in the scene that we're working on, and that impacts the entire rest of the flow of the scene. And there might be something we really like at the end that no longer works with the changes that we have at the beginning. So I definitely recommend reading all the way through, using the highlighting and noting, figuring out what you want to do, where you want to start with your edits, and then get moving forward. So after you've figured out how to work on minimal change and making it impactful changes, let's talk about low emotional impact. Low emotional impact happens when your readers aren't connecting with the emotions in the story. Usually this happens in one of 2 ways. Either you put too much emotion in too soon, or the emotion that you give your characters lacks nuance. So think about the last time you planned a vacation or a holiday. You were really excited about it, right? Maybe that vacation, though, wasn't for 2 months. Did you have the same level of excitement the entire time you were waiting for this vacation to happen? Absolutely not. You might have had an initial surge of excitement when you started with the planning, but then all the what ifs and the doubts came in. What if I don't have money for this? What if I can't get time off of work? What if I can't find somebody to take care of my home and my pets? What if, what if, what if? And then as we do the planning and all of those what ifs start to go away, our excitement starts to build again. And then maybe our excitement is really, really peaked when we're packing the car or we're heading to the airport. But then that level of excitement isn't sustainable. So then we get maybe a little bit bored on the drive. Maybe the plane flight is a little bit turbulent and we get a little bit nervous about, landing safely. And then we get to our destination and we're awed by how beautiful everything is. But then halfway through the vacation, we start thinking about, I got to go back to work at the end of this. And then that excitement starts to taper off a little bit, but then we do something really exciting and really fun, and we get really excited about it again. So what I'm trying to show you is that emotion doesn't just have one note, even if it's a positive emotion or a negative emotion. There are lots of nuances there. Your scenes should have that same level of nuance for your readers, because if we give a reader too much emotion too soon, they get exhausted from it. And if we lack the nuance, then the emotion doesn't feel realistic to your reader because they're used to ebbs and flows and highs and lows. So when we get to a place where we don't feel like we have enough emotional impact in our scene, we want to help the readers connect to the emotion using empathy. Empathy is when we can kind of put ourselves in someone else's position and feel what they're feeling. In real life, those emotions build and those emotions change. So if you only have one emotion through your scene, or your emotion goes from mundane to a spiked emotion too fast, it's going to be harder for your readers to connect with that because it's not true to their own experiences. So what you want to do is you want to look at your scene and you want to think about the nuance. Your characters don't go from meh to excited or meh to screaming angry right away. That tension is going to build, that excitement is going to build, and your reader wants to see those changes in emotions. So if you're having a hard time figuring out the emotional flow, when you're reading, you want to try reading aloud. And again, I'm going to suggest use the read aloud mode because you're going to listen for emotional cues. You're going to listen for words and body language that are showing different emotions. And then you're going to highlight them. Anytime there's a shift in emotion, you're going to use a different color. Or you're going to put in the margin what the name of that emotion is. So let's say in the example that we were using about going on vacation, we start with excitement and then we get a little bit of worry. Excitement might be yellow. Worry might be gray. And then as we start to do the planning, maybe that gray gradually turns back into yellow for excitement. So highlight those shifts. If you're noticing that your whole scene is just one color, or you only have two big chunks of color, you're going to look for opportunities for nuance, and you're going to find places where there are unrealistic emotional shifts. Somebody goes quick to anger too fast, and your reader isn't going to understand it. Somebody starts crying seemingly for no reason. You as the author know why they're crying, but your reader might not know it. So make sure that you're identifying those areas where there should be shifts in that emotion. At the end of your editing, when you color code your emotions, you want it to look more like a rainbow than one color or just two colors. That's really going to help your readers connect with the emotion of the story. Moving on to number 3, unbalanced dialogue. So readers connect with your story through emotion, but readers connect with your characters through dialogue. If you think about it, when you meet somebody new, how do you get to know them? You talk to them. You learn about them, you learn about their experiences, and we want to use that same dialogue for your readers to connect with your characters. In general, there are two kinds of unbalanced dialogue. There's too much prose. This is when you as the author have a lot of story to tell about the characters, about the scene, about the setting, and you tell a lot of the action that's happening, but we don't get to hear from our characters. So you'll notice in my little picture here, the prose is this light bulb pencil, and you can see that there is dialogue in this scene, but there's like a lot of it in the middle, but the balance between prose is much, much heavier. It puts a disconnect between your reader and the characters because they're hearing about your characters. They're not going on the journey with your characters. Other way that you can have unbalanced dialogue is you can have a good balance between prose and dialogue, but you can have an an overly talkative character. And you can see here the character who is has the black quotation marks. Um, has a lot of space in the scene. The character who has the green quotation marks only shows up at the beginning, and the character that has the red quotation marks only shows up at the end. That's very unbalanced dialogue. Your reader might wonder what happened to the green character. And at the end, where is this red character coming from? I don't know anything about them. Who are they? So once we identify that we have an unbalanced dialogue, we need to fix it. And we want to fix it by balancing that prose and that dialogue. And we want to give characters equal space on the page. So in the example that I have here, you'll notice that there is the same amount of prose that we had in the other scenes. It's just balanced in the conversation. We hear the characters' voices, and then the prose supports what's happening. Now, there are some genres where just traditionally there's more prose than there is dialogue. There's definitely room for that, but just think about the balance. You always want to have a balance. Maybe there is a big prose at the beginning, but then the rest of your scene is mostly dialogue. Or maybe you have a chunk of prose at the beginning and a chunk of prose at the end, and the middle part is all dialogue. Some of this is going to be your author style and what you want. But in general, your readers are going to get to know your characters through dialogue. So the more dialogue you can put on the page, the better your readers are going to be able to know and connect with your characters. The next thing that we have to do is we have to make sure that the characters have equal space on the page. You can notice now with this picture that I put at the bottom, all of the characters show up all of the time throughout the scene. Yes, sometimes, like here in this middle part, the character who's in black has more to say. Maybe here, this red one is a little bit smaller and this green one is a little bit smaller. But in general, they all kind of talk around the same time. Now, you might be asking yourself, but Laura, I have a character who hardly talks at all. That's okay. There are lots of people. We all know somebody in our life who maybe grunts and points a lot, but doesn't actually say anything until they are pushed to say something or they're in a critical moment. But we always know that they're there and in the room. Most of the time, we're looking to their body language to see how they feel. Are they crossing their arms? Are they nodding? Are they smiling? Are they kind of chuckling under their breath? There are lots of ways that people communicate without using their voice. Making sure that we're putting that body language into our dialogue assures us that we're going to be able to give our characters equal space on the page, because you want your readers to be able to see your characters in the same way you as the author do. So how do we do this? Using our read, highlight, note method. As you're reading, you want to think about who is talking when. I always suggest, if you're looking at balanced and unbalanced dialogue, color coding your voices, in each one in a different color and a different color than your prose. If you're worried about the balance between prose and dialogue, you can do all your dialogue in one color and all your prose in the other. Or you can spread it out so all of your prose is in one color and each character is in a different color. And then all you have to do is look to see how often the colors appear. When you are reading and you're thinking about and color coding, you're going to look at your opportunities to distribute the prose. Maybe you have a lot of prose and it can go in dialogue. Maybe you're talking about the history of a planet in a sci-fi story. Instead of the narrator telling the reader about the history, maybe you have two people reminiscing about what it was like before this big event that they're journeying to has happened. Maybe you have a history lesson where a teacher is talking to a group of students to tell them about what things were like in another era or another century, right? There are lots of ways that you can move history and even world building into dialogue. looking for opportunities to add dialogue. And like I was talking about, looking for opportunities to add body language as you're making your notes in your reading and your highlights are going to help you move from unbalanced to balanced dialogue. Moving on to muddy voices. Muddy voices happen when your readers feel like all your voices sound the same. As we get further and further into these editing mistakes, you'll notice that it's going to be harder and harder to identify the problem by yourself. Because as the author, oftentimes we can hear the character's voice as we're writing. We have a picture of the character and they sound really loud to us and their voice sounds really distinct. But somehow when we put it on the page, it doesn't seem like it actually is coming across the way that we think it's coming across. And our readers don't get a chance to know the characters the way as we, the authors, get to know them. Sometimes you'll notice that there are muddy voices when you, as the author, are relying on dialogue tags to distinguish who is speaking in a scene, especially when it's a scene with only two people. When it's a scene with only two people and you have that intimacy and that back and forth, sometimes it's nice to drop the dialogue tags, the they said, he said, she said, get them out of there so that it's just the communication between the two characters to draw the reader in. But if the reader has to rely on those dialogue tags to think about who is speaking, then our voices are probably muddy. The other way we can sometimes know that our voices are muddy is that we only have one main difference between our voices. Sometimes we rely on maybe an accent or something like the use of contractions or large words versus small words. All of these things can help distinguish a character's voice, but used independently of other things doesn't really allow the reader to see the nuance that you've created in your character. So we have a way in the Dialogue Doctor community of talking about the way you build voices to make them unique. And we talk about it that voice has 4 parts: words, cadence, pacing, and body language. Words are what a character says. Cadence is how they say it. Pacing is when they say it. And body language is what their body says or what their body is contributing to what they're saying. So when you think about the words that your character says, you want to think about the topics that they are talking about. Voice is going to be a combination of your character's background and history, their personality, and the circumstance that they're currently in. So somebody who has a lot of education, the words that they say may be very large. They may have an extensive vocabulary and they may be very specific in the words that they use. Maybe you have a character who is a child. Children tend to be very focused on themselves and how they are experiencing the world because they haven't really learned empathy so much yet, right? So they think about themselves. So they might use a lot of I statements. They might also talk about their experiences with smaller words because they haven't had a chance to learn as many of the larger words. So thinking about what your character is going to say is one part of voice. The next thing you want to think about is, how is somebody saying this? And this is the grammar that you're going to use on the page. If your character is very bold, and very commanding, they may use short sentences. Every sentence ends with a period. If you have a character who maybe is a little bit of a dreamer, when they talk, they might have a lot of ideas that they string together. Maybe they have a lot of pauses. So there might be a lot of ellipses in what they're saying. You can also use your dialogue tags in the grammar of your quotes and your dialogue. So for example, if you have a character who is very thoughtful and usually thinks before they speak, you can put your dialogue tag and your body language before the quotation marks, because then your reader is automatically going to take a pause the way that that character is going to take a pause. If you have a character who is very excitable and uses a lot of exclamation points, you're probably going to add the dialogue tag that they said at the very end. So everything that they say feels like it comes rushing out of their mouth. If you have a character who maybe takes up a lot of space on the page, doesn't like attention to be drawn away from them, maybe they start their quote, you put their dialogue tag and their body language in the middle, and then you end the quote. Your reader is going to feel like that character takes up a little bit more space than maybe they need to because of the placement of that dialogue tag, the exclamation points, the periods, the commas, the semicolons. All of those things are going to make up the cadence of your characters. Body language is how we communicate non-verbally. When we talk to people in real life, how much of the communication is just the words that that person is saying? Not very much of it, actually. Research will tell you exactly how much. I don't know the exact percentages, but it's like a crazy amount that we look at the physical and listen to the tone of the voice versus actually what the words are being said. So as you're thinking about your character, you want to think about their body language. Are they crossing their arms? Are they leaning forward in their chair? Are they leaning back in their chair? Are they looking away? Are they looking straight at you? Are they making eye contact? Are they not blinking? All of these things are part of communication that we often forget when we're writing, that really creates a connection between characters themselves, but also our reader and those characters. How many times have you been reading a book and the author says that the main character clenches their fist, and you look down and you realize that you're clenching your fist as you're reading because you're connecting, you're using empathy to really get in there to the story with them. That's the power of body language. Make sure you're including it to create unique voices. The last part of the voice quartet, whatever, the 4 parts of voice, is pacing. And pacing is when a character talks. So a few minutes ago, we were talking about a character who doesn't speak a lot. In that case, their pacing would be they have a lot of body language, and then they are the last one in a conversation to speak. Someone who is a leader might walk into a room and be the first person to speak, and they may also be the last person to speak as they leave the room, but they may want during the conversation everybody else's voice to be heard, so maybe they don't talk as much in the middle. So again, think about your character's background, think about their personality, and think about the experience that they are having to figure out how their voice is going to sound. Once you know how their voice is going to sound, you want to modulate that voice because none of us sound the same when we're angry as we do when we're happy. Most of us don't. I shouldn't say none of us. Most people sound different when they're happy than when they're angry, than when they're sad, than when they're content. So think about how these things are going to change. Maybe when a leader is upset, instead of talking in short sentences that end with periods, they're going to use longer sentences and they're going to use exclamation points. Maybe when a child is sad, instead of saying I, they're going to blame and they're going to say you. So thinking about 1 or 2 parts of voice that you can adjust and modulate to make the emotions pop more on the page is going to give a more unique experience to your voices and help your readers connect to each character individually. When you're looking for unique voices, if you hear your beta readers say something to you like, I really didn't know who was talking, or all of your characters kind of sound the same, when you're reading, again, use read aloud mode and listen for the voices. Try whenever you can to not rely on the dialogue tag to tell you who is speaking. If you can, do a quick run through of your scene and take out all your character names and see if you can figure out who is speaking, not based off of what you remember each character saying, but really just listening to their voices. Again, as you highlight, I always recommend highlighting character voices in different colors because then you can just read all of the blue voice, all of the red voice, all of the pink voice, and see how does this voice sound? Does it modulate as they get more emotional? Does it change? Does it feel different than the voice that's in the other color? I will say, just as we talk about using color, if you're going to use color, and actually as you're editing in general, I always recommend pick one thing to work on at a time, because if you try to use color to highlight emotion and you're trying to use color to identify your character voices, you're going to have like an explosion of the rainbow and you might not be able to remember what color means what. So sometimes it's easier to just pick one thing to work on. I'm just going to work on voices, or I'm just going to work on emotion, and then identify your colors for that. As you're reading and you're highlighting, you're going to make notes about opportunities for where your voices might change. So if you're finding that your stoic character, who is not supposed to talk a lot, has a lot of words, when you're making a note, you can make a note that says, too many words, replace with body language. If you have a character who isn't showing up enough in your scene and it's because they are a quiet character, you can make a note to add body language. Maybe you have a character who needs to show that they're getting excited, and you make a note that you want to see more exclamation points, or you want to see moving the dialogue tag from the beginning to the end. There's definitely opportunities for you to identify areas to make change as you're reading. The final element of mistakes that I see authors make as they're editing is creating or not removing reader burden. Reader burden are unintentional questions that pull your reader's focus away from the story. Lots of times we're creating questions for the reader because we want them thinking about the story. Mysteries are the best example of this. You want your readers thinking about who did it, right? You want them thinking about who the villain is in the story, and you want them putting together the clues. That's what you want them thinking about. In a romance, you want your readers thinking about the will they, won't they? Are they right for each other? Does she deserve this? Do they deserve love? What does he want? How is he ready to be in a relationship? Whatever it is, you want your readers thinking about your story. Unintentional questions are things that are pulling your reader's focus away from the story. Things like, who is this character? Maybe you have a character that you introduced early in the story, and then you bring them back in chapter 10. You bring them back and your reader might not remember who they were or what they did. How did these characters get here? Sometimes we jump ahead in our story and we expect our readers to just understand that there's been a huge passage of time. Where are we? Where are we going? Sometimes this can be a question when we don't set the stage for our scene right away. When are we going to get there? When did that happen in the past? This timeline doesn't quite make sense to me. All of the timing questions all fall under the when. And I would say the biggest reader burden question of all is the why. Why are my characters acting like this? Why are they going here? Why are they doing that? This doesn't make any sense to me. Based off of who this character is, I think they should be doing this. Why aren't they doing that? All of these questions, they might just be a little blip, but anytime your reader starts thinking about a question that isn't an intentional question, you're drawing their focus away from the story, which means that the real world has an opportunity to pull their focus away from your story, because most of us have a limited amount of time to read. So when the story has us captive, it's easier to stay within the story. But when we start to allow our mind to drift into other things, the real world has an opportunity to get it. So how do we prevent that from happening? We want to answer the questions before our reader thinks to ask them. So we want to add reminders in the story. Even if something happened just a couple of chapters ago, one or two words to remind the reader who this character is and why they're important to the story. We want to focus on the realism. We talked about this in the emotional element, but this also has to deal with the choices that your characters are making. In this actual situation, would this character act this way? You definitely want to be thinking about this. Often, when we're challenged on reader burden, we, as the author, go, well, that's because, and we have this great explanation about why the character acted the way they did, why they're making the choice that they made. So that is fantastic. If you know why that's happening, make sure you're finding a way to put it on the page so that you explain it to the reader before they have a chance to go, well, wait a minute, why is that happening? I don't understand. So use your that's because as explanations whenever you can. The other part of reader burden, which kind of feels the opposite of what we're talking about, is over explaining. Sometimes we have so excited about the telling of the story that we give every single detail of every single thing that happened before this moment. And then the reader has to have the burden of how much of these details do I actually have to remember and how many of these details are just there for fun. So as you're thinking about turning reader burden into reader enjoyment, think about what does the reader actually need because it explains what's happening, because it's creating realism, and because it's reminding us of who our characters are. And if it isn't doing one of those three things, maybe we don't need this detail in this moment. The final thing of reader enjoyment, as we're reading, again, going back to the tips at the very beginning, forget everything you know about your story, forget everything you know about your characters, forget everything you know about good story writing, and just read what's on the page. As you're reading, highlight new information. Anything new that you haven't ever talked about before gets one color. Anything that needs to be related back or told based off of something else that happened earlier in the story, that gets a different color. Anything that's going to create a question needs to get another color. If I were editing with a client here, with an author, I would put all the new information in green, all of the ideas that are based off of a different part of the story in yellow, and any questions that I had in red. And then in the margins, I would note what details need to be added. New information, I would just make sure that it makes sense. Maybe I don't actually need to add anything because we're giving the information. The ideas based on other parts of the story, I might identify where, what chapter or what scene it happened. And I might make a quick detail of add 2 or 3 words about who this character is. Something as easy as my sister showed up or the boss came in, whatever it is. Sometimes it doesn't have to be a whole paragraph. It can just be a couple of words. Sometimes you're going to need a sentence. And then any questions that I have would be marked in yellow, and I would write that question out in the margin. If you're doing this for yourself, you can do exactly the same thing. Going back to your, well, that's because ideas, making sure that those things get into your margins so that when you actually go into edit, you know what you're putting in so that you can make meaningful changes. Those are the 5 editing mistakes and how to fix them. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen now so that we can go to the questions. So it looks like maybe there are a couple questions here. So I can see in the chat that there's a statement that says, I'm always struggling to make certain there is dialogue consistency with my characters. I literally have one editing pass to look at individual characters and how they speak. That is such a good way of going through and ensuring character consistency. Sometimes we want to do that early on in the story, maybe after 4 or 5 chapters. So we really know what the character's voice is supposed to be. And then we can use that throughout the whole rest of our story. And sometimes we want to wait until the end and read through all the way from beginning to end, just to make sure that that character is really consistent. But I definitely love that, that idea there. So thank you for that. Um, yes. So we have a note here from Self Pub with Andy. Thank you. As a guy, I'm very mindful of mansplaining in case it destroys reader enjoyment. Yes, I definitely think that that's something that we want to be careful about. We don't want to over explain things, but there's always a character in, especially in like a crime drama, where really their only goal in being a character is to explain like acronyms and things to you. So sometimes like you'll have that character who will be like, "Sure, Captain, I'll put out that all points bulletin for you." After the captain was like, "Put out the APB," right? Like sometimes you're going to need that character in there, but I definitely think making sure you're not over explaining is really helpful there. So let's see, what else do we have? How would I get consistent character voices throughout? Again, Self Pub with Andy. Thank you so much for that. So our recommendation is always to create, we call it a character wheel, but any kind of document that you want to put together that identifies the 4 elements of character voice. Thinking about what kind of words they're going to use, the topics, are they going to use big words or small words? Do they have a catchphrase that they're going to use often? Not every time they speak, but often. Writing that down, thinking about the cadence that you want them to use. What kind of punctuation are they going to use? Are they always going to trail off at the end of their sentence? Is their body language going to be the bulk of what they're saying? Is their body language going to go at the beginning or at the end of their statement? I know dialogue tags can be very controversial in the writing and editing world. From my perspective, dialogue tags are just another part of grammar that we can use to distinguish voices. And if we're only putting them at the end and we're only using said, we're limiting what we can do with that voice. But you as an author get to choose what you want to do. So you decide if you want it to be part of voice. And if you do, then make it a note in your cadence. Thinking about pacing, where do you want the character to speak? Do you want them to speak often or do you want them to speak very little? Thinking about that, writing it down and pacing. Again, body language. Most people tend to be really consistent with body language. I have a tendency to talk with my hands a lot, but my hand gestures always stay kind of close to my body. I don't do a lot of big pointing gestures. Everything kind of stays close to me. So if I was making a note about my own voice, I would write down that I have kind of close hand gestures. Keeping that log or that snapshot of what your character's voice looks like allows you to go through your story and make sure that your character is consistent all the way through the story. So that's my recommendation there. If a character is adapting through the series, how can you allow that while also keeping his voice? Yes, this is a great question. So yes, your character should be modulating. Your character, if your character is growing and they have a growth arc in their story, they are going to sound different at the end of the story than they did at the beginning of the story, but they're still going to sound like themselves. My best tip for learning how people modulate their voices is to spend time thinking about the person who is closest to you. So maybe that's your partner, maybe it's one of your siblings, maybe it's one of your parents, maybe it's a best friend, maybe it's somebody at work, somebody you can just picture what they're going to say and how they're going to react in certain situations and break their voice down, thinking about how they're going to modulate, thinking about where they start and where they end. They have core elements to their language. They have core elements to their body language. They have core elements to their cadence, but it always sounds a little bit different. So when you're modulating a voice across the story, it's always going to be the same voice, but yes, it's going to look different at the end of the story than it does at the beginning. So in a series, your second book is going to pick up where your character voice left off at the end of book one. And it's going to pick up there, and it's going to have its own modulation, and it's going to have its own growth arc, and it's going to end at the end of book two. And then book three is going to pick up at the end of book two, and you're going to so on and so forth as your character continues to grow. So that was a great question. I really appreciate that. I also see we have somebody talking about geek-splaining in the chat there too. Yes, geek-splaining is something that is can be very exciting, especially when you're really into sci-fi and you love the science fiction of it, but not every sci-fi reader loves science fiction. So finding the way to balance the geek-splain with like everyday terminology, that is definitely a balance there. So good luck with that. Definitely using your beta readers and the people that you trust to read your story to let you know, hey, do you understand this or do I need more? I also agree that we should normalize geek-splaining. So let's see. Here's another question. When you get so excited that you know a lot about something and you can't help explaining it, even though others might already know it. Yes. Okay. Oh, I see. That's that's the definition of geek-splaining. Yes, I love that. I think that's perfect. Not everyone wants to know the math. Yes. Some people do though. So finding a way, actually, while we're talking about that, I work with an author regularly who writes sci-fi, and I enjoy sci-fi, but it's not my favorite story to go to. And I remember we were working together kind of early on in our partnership, and I read the story, and I told her, I was like, I don't really connect with this scene very much because it's very, very scientific. And I gave her an opportunity to kind of like tell me why this was so important to the story. And she's talking about how nanobots get into the brain and are like making new connections in the brain to heal these people and give them superpowers. And I'm like, I was awed. I was, first of all, the fact that somebody can think about these things is amazing. But then, like, the excitement that she had about what this was just wasn't coming across on the page. So, after we talked about it a while, we identified that if the character who is as excited about this nanobot technology as she, as the author is, could explain it to the people in the room in the way that she had explained it to me, I, as the reader, would be as excited about it as she was. So, Ward, you're saying about the math being not everyone's excited to know the math. If you can find a way to have your characters talk about math in the way that you talk about it, and it makes it really exciting, then your readers are going to fall in love with it. So, long story short, after she edited that scene, she sent it back to me and I read it. And all the same details about this nanobot technology were there. All the different parts of the brain were all still listed, but they were listed in a way that was easy to understand. And somebody like me, who doesn't really have a lot of science background, was able to be really excited about and connect with. So there are definitely opportunities to geek-splain in your stories. You just have to do it in a way that your readers are going to be as excited about it as you are. So, all right, we're kind of coming to the end of the hour. As you are, if there are any other questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. I just wanted to quick say, again, thank you so much to Rachel and Shelley for moderating for us today. They were fantastic keeping up with your comments, especially when I couldn't see them. And there is a survey in the chat. Rachel dropped it off there. So thank you for that. Please go in and do that. Enjoy the rest of the conference. There are some amazing, amazing speakers here. So please make sure that you jump in and listen to what they have to say. If you'd like to learn more about character voice or any of these other editing mistakes that we've talked about, you can visit dialogdoctor.com and learn how to join our community. We've got a Slack channel, we've got a podcast, we do courses throughout the year. We do writing dashes. So anything that you need, you can join us in the community. Rachel, thanks for dropping the website there. Again, I am really excited to connect with you all as we move forward. Last chance for questions in the chat. All right, as my colleague at the Dialogue Doctor says, I'm going to take silence as affirmation. Thanks so much for joining me today. I had a great time talking to you. Hope to see you soon.